Good morning, everyone. We are back reading our Revolutionary War story today. I hope everybody had a great weekend. I'm wearing my Akuna Matata shirt because we were doing the Lion King earlier this year, and I just wanted to bring a little bit of no worries to everybody's day today. So let's get started with our story. Will we ever win this war? In 1777, Joseph Plum Martin, now 17, decided to rejoin the Continental Army. He agreed to serve until the end of the war. The general's opinion on the people was that the war would not continue no more than 3 years longer, Martin said. Don't tell Joseph, but the American Revolution was going to last 6 more years. A long way from victory. Sure, the Americans won the Great Saratoga victory, but the British were still determined to smash this revolution. And they still had thousands of soldiers in the United States. In fact, they had thousands of soldiers in the capital of the United States. In September of 1777, the main British army, under the command of General William Howe, captured the city of Philadelphia. Members of Congress packed very quickly and escaped to York, Pennsylvania. Now, in the winter of 1777, George Washington was facing the same old maddening problems: lack of soldiers, lack of food, and lack of clothing. The army was now not only starved, but naked, said Joseph Plum Martin. The greatest part were not only shirtless and barefoot, but destitute in all of their clothing, especially blankets. No, the Americans were nowhere near winning this war. Terrible times at Valley Forge. Washington decided to keep his army close to Philadelphia that winter. He wanted to make sure General Howe didn't make any sudden, unexpected moves. So, in December of 1777, 11,000 American soldiers marched towards a place called Valley Forge, about 20 miles west of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. Some of the men were so exhausted by the march, they leaned on their guns and slept standing up. Others were more worried about their aching feet. Dr. James Thatcher reported, "It was not uncommon to track the march of men over ice and frozen ground by the blood of their naked feet." There wasn't much at Valley Forge, just some bare trees and windy hills covered with frost and dead grass. Since some kind of shelter was needed, Washington ordered his men to build log cabins. 20 soldiers would live in each cabin. The men who knew how to build log cabins finished theirs in 2 days. Then they helped the other city boys who had no idea about building houses out of logs. Washington knew his army was facing a dangerously long, hard winter. Martha Washington, who came to stay at Valley Forge, could see the concerns in her husband's face. Martha and the other women in camp knitted socks and shirts as fast as they could, and the men badly needed the clothing. Some had nothing but ragged summer clothes, and they could be seen dashing from hut to hut wrapped in blankets. When soldiers were on duty, they stood on their hats to keep their bare feet from freezing into the snow. When they weren't on duty, they shivered in their cabins, coughing from the smoke from their fires and trying to ignore the hunger pains in their bellies. The only one who had anything nice to say about Valley Forge was a young soldier named Richard Wheeler. "We were very comfortable, and living on the fat of the land," wrote Richard to his mother. Richard wasn't quite telling the truth. He just didn't want his mother to worry. And she would have worried had she had known that there was no food at Valley Forge, and that the horses were starving to death and dropping dead in the middle of camp. Men, also starving, were too weak to bury those heavy horses. "The carcasses of dead horses were lying in and near the camp," complained Washington. "The rotting horse bodies stink up the whole camp and help spread disease among the weakened soldiers." An increasingly desperate and angry George Washington watched more than 2,500 soldiers die from cold, hunger, and disease at Valley Forge. He was furious with Congress for not doing more to supply the army, and he knew that if the British chose this moment to attack, his army would be ruined. New hope in the spring. Back in Valley Forge, life was slowly beginning to improve. Spring brought warmer weather, and wagons full of food began rolling into the army camp. Soldiers set up their own little theater and put out plays. George and Martha Washington were always in the audience. George also relaxed by tossing a ball back and forth with his officers. While Washington was a humble man, he was always proud of his strong right arm. I have several times heard them say, said a friend, that he never met any man who could throw to so great a distance as George Washington. Another welcome sight at Valley Forge was a short, loud German fellow named Frederick Steuben. Steuben impressed the Americans by telling them he had been a general in Germany. In fact, he had been a pretty low-ranking officer. He was very valuable to Washington, though, because he had years of experience training soldiers. And since most of the American volunteers had come straight from farms or workshops, they needed as much training as they could get. Steuben got up at 3 in the morning each day to begin work. He broke the soldiers into small groups, personally showing each group how to work together in battle. The only problem was, he didn't speak English. When soldiers misunderstood Steuben's commands, he often exploded into red-faced fits of shouting and cursing. First, he cursed in German, then in French, and finally, he called to his translator to translate all the things he was saying to the troops. The men laughed. Then they tried the exercise again, and again, and again. Joseph Plum Martin, who was one of the many soldiers trained by Steuben that spring, noticed that the men seemed to have a new energy and confidence. They were eager to get out of Valley Forge and win some battles in the year of 1778. Back in action. In June 1778, the British Army marched out of Philadelphia under the command of General Henry Clinton. The British had enjoyed the capital city, but now it was time to get back to business. The business of attacking the Americans. On his way out of town, John Andre stole everything he could, carrying from Ben Franklin's house, including scientific instruments and a large painting of the famous American. Washington, who was ready to fight himself, and on a scorching hot day in late June, the Americans attacked Clinton's army in New Jersey. In spite of the high hopes, this was another disappointing day for George Washington. He had made the mistake of putting a general named Charles Lee in charge of leading the attack. Lee was famous for his strange habits, including wearing filthy clothes and bringing his dog to fancy dinner parties. When the battle began, Lee decided not to follow Washington's plan. Lee attacked for a little while, then ordered his army to retreat. The soldiers stood around wondering what to do next. That's when a furious George Washington rode up and called General Lee nothing but a coward. It was the only time American officers ever heard George Washington swear, so you know he was pretty mad. While Washington tried to organize his soldiers, the temperature soared to 100 degrees. As they did in many battles, brave women and men earned the nicknames Molly Pitchers by carrying pitchers of water to men on the battlefield. Soldiers needed the water to cool down from the blazing sun and the hot firing of the cannons. One of the most famous Molly pitchers was Mary Ludwig. She dodged bullets at the Battle of New Jersey to deliver water to her husband's cannon crew. When Mary's husband fainted from the heat, she stepped up to his cannon and started blasting at the British. Joseph Plum Martin saw the whole thing. A cannon shot from the enemy passed directly between her legs without doing any other damage than carrying away all the lower part of her petticoat. Like so many Americans during this revolutionary time, this one had no clear winner. And by the end of 1778, Americans were no closer to winning the revolution. General Lee, by the way, was kicked out of the Continental Army for disobeying orders. Arnold's fiendish plan. So we're picking up in our story with Benedict Arnold, who was the general back at the Battle of Saratoga who helped us win. In the summer of 1780, Benedict Arnold took over command at West Point, an American fort on the Hudson River in New York. Control of West Point was so important, Washington called it the key to America. It was also the key to Arnold's plan. Here's how it was supposed to work. Arnold and Andre would agree on a time for the British to attack West Point. Uh-oh. Arnold would make sure to have his soldiers in all the wrong places, and the British would capture the fort easily. So, in this point in our story, Benedict Arnold has switched sides and joined the British as like a spy, and the Americans aren't aware of this. And there was more. George Washington was coming to inspect West Point in September. If the British timed their attack just right, they could grab General Washington too. In exchange, Arnold would be paid a cool £20,000 and made a general in the British Army. One of the most amazing things about Benedict Arnold's plot is just how close it came to working. Imagine how different our history would be if Washington had been taken to Britain and hanged. Arnold made a critical mistake though. He insisted on meeting Andre face to face so the two men could work out last minute details of their plans. At about 2 in the morning on September 22nd, Andre rowed a small boat to a dark spot on the shore of the Hudson River. Arnold was waiting for him. And Arnold escapes. Back at West Point, Arnold was eating breakfast at his headquarters when a messenger dashed in and handed over an urgent note. Arnold tore it open and read, "A British spy has been captured with maps of West Point in his boots." Arnold leapt up from the table, ran upstairs as fast as his bag leg would carry him, and told Peggy the terrible news. Then he hobbled outside, raced his horse down the river, hopped on a boat, and started rowing south. That was the last time anyone saw Benedict Arnold in an American uniform. At that very moment, George Washington and his staff were approaching Arnold's headquarters. The men were all looking forward to seeing the famously beautiful Peggy. But as the boat approached Arnold's house, it started to seem like something wasn't right. Arnold should have fired a few cannons as a salute to the commander-in-chief, but the cannons were silent. The incorrectness of his conduct when he knew I was about to be there was very noticeable, Washington later said, but I had not the least idea of the real cause. Just minutes later, he learned the real cause. As Washington was sitting down to lunch in Arnold's house, another messenger ran in and handed over papers found in John Andre's boot. They were maps and plans for attacking West Point, all in Benedict Arnold's handwriting. Washington sat quietly for a moment, holding the papers in his shaking hands. He finally looked up at General Henry Knox and said, "Arnold has betrayed me. Whom can we trust now?" Washington soon shook off the shock and went to work. He got the soldiers at West Point ready for a British attack. Then he put John Andre on trial, found him guilty of being a spy, and hanged him. Washington would much rather have hanged Arnold, but Arnold was beyond his reach, safe in British headquarters in New York City. Peggy, meanwhile, managed to save her skin with a brilliant bit of acting. When Washington came to her room, Peggy threw a hysterical fit, shouting over and over, "That is not General Washington. That is the man who is going to kill my child." She was so shocked by her husband's treason, it seemed, that she had lost her senses. Washington was convinced that she had nothing to do with the plot. Peggy later joined her husband in the safety of British headquarters in New York. No sight and end. Once again, Washington had barely escaped disaster. And while there is something to be grateful for, the entire country was getting sick and tired of this war. The American Revolution entered its 7th year in 1781, and with no end in sight. The government didn't even have enough money to pay its soldiers. One day in February, Washington was walking up the stairs at his headquarters. Halfway up the staircase, he met his 20-year-old assistant, Alexander Hamilton, who was coming down. Washington told Hamilton he needed help right away with some very important papers. "I answered him immediately," said Hamilton. Washington went to his office and sat down. He waited. No Hamilton. Washington stepped into the hall and started pacing back and forth above the staircase. His impatience turned to anger, and his anger bubbled toward a boiling point. Finally, he spotted Hamilton at the bottom of the stairs. Washington said, "Colonel Hamilton, you have kept me waiting at the head of the stairs for the last 10 minutes. "I must tell you, sir, you treat me with much disrespect." Hamilton replied, "I am not conscious of it, sir, but since you thought it necessary to tell me, we must part." And the young man turned and walked away. Less than an hour later, Washington sent an apology to Hamilton, blaming his outburst on a moment of passion. Hamilton accepted the apology and came back to work. But it was clear that the never-ending stress was starting to affect George Washington, and everyone else too. Joseph Plum Martin spoke for the entire United States when he said, "I saw no likelihood that the war was going to ever end." So that's where we're going to leave off in our story today. We're right in the thick of it as the Americans are starting to get worn down by the war. So we'll see next time when we read our last chapter on how they respond. All right, everybody have a great day and take care. Go enjoy some sun.